Hello and welcome back to Supposedly Fun. My name is Greg. I am here today to do the third annual installment of books that I read this year that I hope more people will discover. I'll have a link to the videos that I did from last year and the year before that down below if you would like to check them out. I really enjoy doing this video every year. I try to think about it in a bunch of different ways. It might be a known author, but a lesser known work of theirs. It could be a book that people just generally haven't really been talking about, at least not in my corner of BookTube. I love the sense of discovery of finding new books, and I love trying to help people discover new books. So hopefully these videos are things that you find helpful as well. And I'm really happy to talk about these books. I just enjoy doing this video. The first one that I want to talk about in this video is actually now a sort of honorable mention because it felt like it was really flying under the radar. Not a lot of people had read it when I read it back in, I think, September, maybe October. I don't remember when, but I actually started my 2022 list of books that I want more people to discover as soon as I finished reading this book because I knew I was going to want to talk about it in this video. Since then, a lot more people have discovered it. It's Night of the Living Res by Morgan Talty. So I feel like it can't really be part of the official list anymore. I'm just going to give it an honorable mention and say that I hope more people continue to discover this book because it's been really gratifying to see people picking this book up and reading it since I read it myself and just loved it. I feel like every year there's a book that I latch onto and just want to hand people so they can read it and hopefully will have the same reaction to it that I did. And this year it is Night of the Living Res by Morgan Talty. This is a collection of linked stories. I think it was Brian at Bookish who said he actually prefers to think of it as a novel that is not in chronological order. And I think that actually kind of makes sense, especially since a lot of people don't like short stories and that becomes a barrier for entry to things. But this is a beautiful book. It is about Indigenous life on the Penobscot Reservation in Maine. It is about addiction and family and trauma, especially generational trauma. It's about abuse and persistence and love, and it has a really great sense of humor. I am a huge fan. I do think, because a couple of people have commented on this, you have to get a couple of stories in for this to really start taking hold. And then for me, by the end, it was just a sucker punch. I'm a big fan of this book. I know a lot of people also picked this up because they read it in November for Skoden, which I did not participate in, but I'm so happy that this was a book that a lot of people used when they participated in that read along. It's a great book. Again, if you haven't read it, pick it up. But because a lot of people have since picked it up, at least in my corner of BookTube, I feel like I can't have it on the official list, but I do want to encourage anyone who has not picked it up yet to get out and do so. It's a really great book. And Morgan Talty is a great Twitter follow. He seems like a very nice, funny guy as well, for whatever that's worth in the world. The next book is something that is one of my favorite reads of the year. And Joel and I both talked about it because we read it early on in 2022. And it was one of our favorite reads at the midpoint of the year. I'll link that video down below as well. It's Don't Cry For Me by Daniel Black. And this is still going to be on my list of favorite books when we do our actual annual wrap up at the end of the year. I believe it will still be high up on Joel's list as well. There were some people who talked about this back in January when it was released, but it feels like everything has just gone totally quiet on this book ever since. And I think it's a shame. I know there were a couple people who picked this book up around the time of its release and didn't enjoy it anywhere near as much as I did or had some problems with it. Maybe it's that it's a story that is particularly attuned to my own emotional baggage. We all bring our own emotional baggage into a book with us, and this is sort of perfectly attuned to mine. But I love it, and I really think a lot of other people would like it as well. So I just hope that conversation really starts to build around this book. Maybe when they get ready for a paperback release, people will sort of rediscover it and it will have a new life. I just want to keep putting it out into the universe so people will pick it up and find it, because I think this is a really beautiful and heartfelt and insightful and empathetic book. It is a novel in letters, and I usually have problems with novels in letters because when a book is supposed to be one really long letter, I really have a problem with it. But this is actually a series of letters. Like each chapter is a letter that a father is writing to his estranged son. And He is not planning on sharing these letters with his son directly. He's not planning on sending them. He's sort of collecting them for his son to discover after he is gone, because he is dying of cancer fairly early or fairly young. And in the letters, he is sort of explaining to his son, who is gay, why he was the type of father that he was. And what's remarkable about the book as well is that he's not asking for pity, hence the title. He's not asking for understanding. He knows that it might be too late for them to fix their relationship, but he wants his son to understand who he was. And I think that's a really difficult concept for a lot of people. You know, you always grapple with who your parents were before you were born, why they may have done the things that they did, why they may have struggled to support you in the ways that you needed. And I found it really fascinating. It's really about, as a child, he was taught not to be emotional. He was taught not to be attached to people and loving, which is a shame because he was a very emotional and loving child. And again, there are ways in which he messes up and he's a bad person, but you really do come to an understanding of him throughout the book. I really loved it. Joel did an interview with Daniel Black with Erica from The Broken Spine. I'll link that down below as well. Daniel Black is a fascinating man and had a lot of very interesting things to say about the book and why he wrote it and how he was inspired to write it, and a little bit about whether or not there's going to be a sequel. And I'm really looking forward to that. Yeah. So I would absolutely recommend this book if you haven't picked it up. It's great. If you have a complicated relationship with your father, it will feel cathartic for you. It definitely did for me. And it's a beautiful book. I would highly recommend it if you have not read it already. The next book I want to talk about is one that I don't actually own. I got it from the library in the month of January, and it has really sat with me throughout the rest of 2022. It's Agatha of Little Neon by Claire Luchette. I heard about this book on NPR's Book of the Day podcast and immediately put a hold on it at my local library, and it became available like immediately. It was a book that I think someone had mentioned to me at some point last year, and I didn't get around to reading until January when NPR's Book of the Day podcast put it back on my radar. I'm so glad I read it. It's a very quiet book. It almost can feel like not a lot is happening, but actually a lot of seismic activity is happening sort of underneath the surface. So Agatha is a nun at an order, and it closes. She and the other nuns in her order are then sent to be the patrons of a halfway house in Woonsocket, Rhode Island, and that is the little neon of the title. It's painted a violent shade of green, hence so the residents have nicknamed it Little Neon. And it's about her sort of awakening, and that takes time. So again, it can seem like not much is happening, but as she goes about her new life in this new order, she starts to question everything about her faith, about the way she lives her life, about what drew her to the order and to become a nun, and what she might be hiding from, and whether or not that is good for her in the long term. It's a really beautiful book and very quiet, but I would say also very powerful by the time you get to the end. And I really deeply appreciated it and what it is doing. And like I said, I have sat with this book since I read it in January, and I've periodically thought about it. And I have only, heard one, maybe two, a small handful of other people talk about it. And I hope that it is a book that more people will discover, because it's a very quietly powerful book, I think. I would say if you liked Small Things Like These by Claire Keegan, this would probably be a good one for you to check out. I think it definitely would live up to that. So yeah, absolutely. It's a good book, and I hope more people will discover it. The next one is something that I listened to on audio back in April or May, somewhere around there. It's Ma and Me by Putsata Reang. This is a memoir, and it's about Putsata Reang's very complicated relationship with her mother and how they became estranged over time. You might be sensing a bit of a theme here. I am really into books about complicated relationships with a parent lately. I've been thinking about it a lot, and this is such a beautifully told version of that. It's about how her relationship with her mother was almost codependent in a sense, because her mother saved her life essentially as they were leaving to immigrate to the United States. They were on a boat, and the baby Putsata Reang, seemed to be dead, and somebody told her, just throw the baby overboard. It's done. Save yourself the trouble. And her mother insisted on carrying her. They got to a camp where there was a doctor, and it turned out she was okay. And obviously she's alive today and writing. And she always felt like she owed something to her mother because of that. So she worked very hard to be the perfect daughter for her mother. I believe they're from Cambodia. So she wanted to be the perfect Cambodian daughter. And what she comes to over time is that she can't be the perfect Cambodian daughter because they've lived in the United States. She is pretty inherently American at this point. She's obviously grown up with the traditions of the country where her parents are from and where she was born, but she identifies much more as the daughter of immigrants in the United States. And she really struggles with that. And she also struggles with it because over time, she grows to know that she is a lesbian. And that is something that her mother will really have a difficult time dealing with. And sure enough, when she does start the coming out process, it does not go well. And it's about the tension between them, the love between them, and the forces that pull them apart over time, and the hope that they might be able to come together in the future. It's really a beautiful, well-written book and emotional in a lot of ways. And I would just very highly recommend it. Obviously, I recommend all of these books since I'm talking about them in this video, but I only really know one other person who has read this, and that is Chelsea, one of the owners of Montana Book Company. And I know she was a huge fan of this as well. So I hope more people will discover it because I think it's just a really great story and very well told. That takes us to another one that I actually have in my hands. I have the Franklin Library edition of it. It's now in November by Josephine Johnson. I read this for my Pulitzer Prize project. There is actually a newer edition of this book that was just released in 2022. I'll put an image of it here so you can see it, but my version doesn't have that. So this was a Pulitzer Prize winner in 1935, I believe. It was published in 1934. And Josephine Johnson was the youngest, still today, the youngest person to have won a Pulitzer Prize for fiction. And I'm working on my Pulitzer Prize deep dive for this book, and I'll talk more about that and a lot of other things when I eventually get around to doing that video. I'm hoping this week, but maybe next week. We'll see how everything goes. But she achieved a lot of success early in her career and then kind of faded away. So by the time she died in 1990, she had faded into obscurity, and the book had largely been forgotten. I am very much hoping that with this new edition of the book that has been published, with the new cover and all of that, that she is somebody who is poised for a rediscovery. I kind of think about how a lot of people, and when I say people, I mean like white people and white academics, didn't really talk about Nella Larsen's passing, and it feels like over the last 10, 15 years, Nella Larsen and passing have really come back into the conversation about classic literature in the United States. And I'm kind of hoping that Josephine Johnson will be on a similar path. Obviously, it will be different because Josephine Johnson was white, but I'm kind of hoping that that same sense of rediscovery will happen for this book. And it feels like it's poised for that to happen. But I really want to make sure it crosses the finish line. This was published during the Depression, the same year that what we think of as the Dust Bowl really started ramping up. And it is commonly referred to as a Dust Bowl novel, but it really reflects all of the things that were leading up to that point. And that for that reason, it probably felt very timely. But it also feels very timely right now because it is about a cash-strapped family trying to make a go of it and having a very hard time. And I think a lot of people living in the current environment can read this book and understand what it was like for this family to be so afraid that they are going to lose everything. And to be on the verge of, it's one of those situations where a couple of good weeks could make all the difference and they could be fine. But one bad week and they could be in disaster. It's a very poignant book and very well told. The writing is beautiful. I'm recommending all of these books, obviously. But I really hope that more people do discover Josephine Johnson and this book, which I think is beautiful and worth remembering. And I'm glad that it is part of the Pulitzer Prize winners because that put it on my radar as part of my Pulitzer Prize project. And hopefully now I can put it on your radar because it is a beautiful book. I know Kim from Middle of the Book March also reread it this year and loved it as well. So if you don't want to take my word for it, maybe you can take hers. Now in November by Josephine Johnson is the real deal. Then there's a book I listened to on audio recently. It's Didn't Nobody Give a Shoot What Happened to Carlotta by James Hannaham. This is a really great audio, actually, because there's two different people who do the audio. One of them does the sort of straight narration of the book, and then another one voices Carlotta, who sort of interjects with commentary and little bits of dialogue and will take little moments to share her own story. Carlotta is a transgender woman who has been imprisoned for a long time, and the book mostly takes place on her first full day after being released on parole. There's a little bit in the beginning where you see Carlotta at her parole hearing and sort of leading up to her release, and there's a little bit in the end that jumps ahead in time as well. But most of it takes place on her first day, where she has to adjust to a world that has moved on without her for the last 20 years, to a family that doesn't know her as the woman that she has transitioned to be, because she made that transition in prison. And she has to deal with the way time has moved on. She has to deal with trying to build her life and the difficulties of that, and how the system is almost inherently set against her, and how many ways she is sort of set up to fail because she doesn't have the coping mechanisms, because she's not used to the world, because there are so many rules and guidelines that she has to follow, and there are so many prejudices against not just former prisoners, but also against transgender women, against people of color, all of those things. So part of the reason I really recommend this book is that I feel like it gives you a good sense of what the world is like for people in this situation, and maybe fosters empathy a little bit. And James Hannaham definitely has a lot of empathy for Carlotta and her situation, and she recognizes that she is not a perfect person either. She is deeply flawed. She makes mistakes, and yet you will love her by the end of the book. It's a great book, and I hope more people will discover it. Then there is Winter Love by Suyin. This cover is highly reflective, so I'm going to try to hold it exactly here where it will not be hitting any glare with the light. I listened to this on audio when we were coming back from our vacation to Italy earlier this year. Have I mentioned lately that I went to Italy? I'll eventually stop. And I really loved it. I loved it so much that I ordered a copy from Montana Book Company, and here it is. It's a very short book, and it was published in the 1960s, which is the thing that really made me want to have a copy for my library, because I thought it had been published now, like this year, and was just falling onto my radar. No, this is just a new edition of a book that had been published before. It's a lesbian love story, and Suyin never wrote anything like that, not in any of the rest of her career, but this is really interesting. And I'd say if you have read Patricia Highsmith, particularly The Price of Salt or Carol, and enjoyed it, this is definitely a book that you should pick up, because it has that same sort of complicated sense of these two people who are in a relationship and all of the obstacles that they have to deal with that have been placed in front of them because people don't approve of two women being together. And it's a really beautiful book. And it's really short. It's only small, so you can seek it out on audio and fit it in a single afternoon, or you can get a copy of the book itself. You can't go wrong either way. I really hope more people will discover this one as well. It deserves a place on a shelf next to, say, The Price of Salt or Carol, as it is known now. It's that good, I would say. Then we go, because that one's a little dark. Now let's move into some books that are a little bit more comforting. And the first one is The Secret Life of Albert Entwistle by Matt Cain. This is sort of a cinnamon bun book. It's just cute. It gives you all the warm, fluffy feelings that you might need, but it's also a little bit serious. So Albert Entwistle has been a postal worker in the UK for almost his entire adult life. He is now turning 65 and finds out that he is going to be sort of forced to retire. And his whole life has been the postal service, so he doesn't know what he's going to do. He is also someone who has really deliberately lived a quiet life and shut other people out. And he doesn't know what to do. It's just him and his cat, and then the cat dies. He finds out he's going to be forced into retirement. And he realizes he needs a change. So he starts venturing out a little bit and sharing bits and pieces of himself with his coworkers and with other people that he meets. He decides that he is going to hunt down the man that he was in love with as a teenager. He hasn't seen him since they were both teenagers and had a little bit of a romance. He decides he is going to come out, search for that man, and try to have a life on his own terms. and find his happiness in the world. And it's just a really cute book, and the way in which things don't just get easy for him. There are difficulties along the way, but how he finds reward for sharing things with people, and how he realizes that he has these deeper connections, and you can find understanding even with people that you don't seem to have a lot in common with, is a really beautiful story. I thought it was just really cute. This was gifted to us by Erica from the Broken Spine. Montana Book Company helped her select it after we lost Guinness, and Joel and I were both really in our feels about that and just feeling emotionally devastated. And this book really helped both of us get out of that and start to pick up the pieces and carry on, because that's all you can do. And I will always be grateful to the book for that. But I really think a lot of other people could enjoy it just as much. It's a really cute story. Not really anything serious, but you don't always have to read serious things. I just really appreciated it and everything that it did. And I loved the story of Albert Entwistle, and I think you might too. The final book I want to talk about is kind of in the same vein as Albert Entwistle. It's Love and Saffron by Kim Fay. This is another really short book. I listened to it pretty much when we were on layover in Paris on our way to Italy. And Joel read it in, I think, 2 days. He started it in the evening one day and finished it in the morning the next day. And it's a really cute story. And what I really particularly love about it is that it is about food and friendship and love, and the way in which food can help facilitate all of those things. Food is sort of like a metaphor for adventure in the world, connection between people, differences between people, and how we can sort of reach across the aisle and find common ground. And share bits of ourselves with other people. So it starts, most of it is a novel in letters that two women are sending back and forth to each other in the early 1960s. There's a chunk in the middle that's not, no spoilers. But for the most part, it is just letters between these two women. And it takes a couple of letters to really get going, because they have to form that really nice friendship. The first girl, who's younger and starting out on a writing career, sends a sort of fan letter to a woman whose articles she really appreciates and includes a gift of saffron in it. And this woman who receives the gift, her name is Imogen, has led not a quiet life, but she's not an adventurous eater. She doesn't know what to do with the saffron. So she writes back and thanks her soon-to-be friend, and kind of admits that she doesn't know what to do. So they start writing back and forth about how to use the saffron and how it went. And then it spins out into this very profound, life-changing friendship for both of them. And it's a very short book, packs a bit of a punch. It has shades of the sort of comfort reading feel of The Secret Life of Albert Entwistle, but it is a little bit serious as well. You might end up crying. I almost did. Joel definitely did. And it's just a really sweet story about connection and love and friendship and food. And I appreciate all of those things. So those are the books that I read this year that I hope more people will discover. I've read a lot of really great books this year, but I'd say those are the ones that probably need the biggest push to get to more people, that haven't been discussed as much as, I personally would like to see. I'd love to hear what you've read this year that you hope more people will discover. Let me know in the comment section down below. And as always, I really appreciate your time, and I will be back. Until next time, happy reading.